Part 6. The Author. Additional for 1883.
President Ulysses S. Grant, Washington, District of Columbia, February 12, 1883. For reasons that will become apparent, the following information was withheld from the initial printing of this handbook. However, rumor and misconception concerning the identity and past of the author followed with it, leading many to discredit the information. There were several ugly conflicts that arose as a result of violent opposition to its very existence. Thomas W. Arlington did not rise to the rank of Director of the National Intelligence Agency for any reason less than being the most informed, adroit, and determined individual I have ever had the honor of fighting alongside. As a tactician, he is to be respected and studied. The inception of the Cartographers and the eventual framing of the information and events within this book are due, largely, to him. I would ask everyone who has read thus far to set aside all preconceived ideas. Remember the changes to our society given purchase and set into motion 2 decades ago, and look to a future when this will no longer be an issue.
Director Thomas W. Arlington, Washington, District of Columbia, July 1st, 1882. For my part, the appearance of the Wendigo in America was at once tragic and transformative. In 1841 I was born into slavery in Mississippi, a place I will not speak of in personal terms out of deference to the allies we may yet make from that state. Suffice to say, my life for the first 2 decades was one of hardship and cruelty. My mother had attempted escape on one occasion prior to my birth. For this she had her feet mutilated. When I was 1 year old and my sister was 3, she attempted escape again. We were caught, and this time, for her continued recalcitrant behavior, she was blinded. This instilled in me from a young age a deep desire to be free, truly free, not simply for myself, but for all of us on the cotton plantation, whose owner I will spare naming, and across the whole of Mississippi and the South. To me and so many others, this mistreatment was so fundamentally against the very idea of what it was to be human, that every fiber of our being yearned to redress the imbalance, not for revenge on our captors, but for mercy to those held captive. I sought out knowledge, wherever it was to be found, studying all I could the world outside our plantation and the surrounding towns. When I learned of the state secession in 1861, I was 20 years old, strong and capable, hiding my keenness for information from every white face and even, I am sorry to say, some of the other workers. Many were so gripped by fear that they would sooner betray one of their own than show a fierce eye to their masters. I hatched a plan to escape, pleading with my mother and sister to join me on it. Looking into the sightless, sad eyes of the woman who raised me, and watching the shake of the head, even as it masked the glow of pride, stabbed at my heart. But my sister was in accordance, and on August 5th, we stole ourselves away into the night. It was a long and terrifying journey northwards through the sweltering heat of Mississippi. Tensions were at breaking point, and black men and women were being killed in the street for crimes both real and imaginary. My sister and I made it through Tennessee and Kentucky to Illinois. At that point an immense weight fell from my shoulders. I cannot describe that feeling adequately. All I can hope is that when the last Wendigo is dispatched, that every American will look up at the sky and feel what we did on that morning as we ventured from the train station and onto the busy street in Aurora. Naturally, at the moment I experienced life, suddenly the idea of risking life and limb on the battlefield seemed a terrible notion. I busied myself working at a library, and for many shameful months became engrossed in the books, shutting out the conflicts of the outside world. My sister and I rented an apartment above the seamstress's shop she was now working for. I could not imagine heaven being more pleasant. However, my sleep was impeded. I lay awake in the quiet hours thinking of the battles being fought at Bull Run, Wilson's Creek, Kessler's Cross, all victories for the Confederacy. I could not escape one single question. Had I been there, would the confluence of events have gone the same way? I planned out troop movements, studying the clashes that occurred, analyzing the strengths and weaknesses on both sides from what I could gather, until finally I could no longer ask myself that question. Tearfully, I bid my sister goodbye and enrolled with the Union Army. Along with the rest of the 7th Illinois Volunteer Infantry Regiment, I began my military career in earnest at the Battle of Fort Henry in February 1862. At the Second Battle of Corinth in October of that year, I found myself once again on Mississippi soil, facing down black slaves, now soldiers for the Confederacy. I recall marveling at the immense power these white men had over those bound to them, to put a sword in their hand and order them across the field, to kill the very men fighting for their liberation. Fearing a shortage of bodies in the South's military forces that would leave them ill-equipped to defend their right to slavery, General Robert E. Lee had used the promise of freedom to those enlisted slaves as a bargaining chip. Should they live or die, their families would be freed, provided the Confederacy eventually won the war. That was a day of victory for the Union, but I confess that a part of me I cannot sum up with tools as clumsy and inappropriate as mere words was lost. In the previous years I had become engrossed in the writings, actions, and political teachings of Frederick Douglass, like me a former slave who fled his bonds, but unlike me, shamefully at the time, one unafraid to agitate and challenge the accepted order of things. He saw injustice and great wrong in the way the black man was treated within our nation, an unspeakable hypocrisy of covering up the ugly practices with the pretense that it was all the will and work of God himself. Douglass fought daily, not just for the freedom of the slaves, but for our suffrage and recognition of equality with all other citizens. I reiterate this now not from some Negro agenda of wresting power from its rightful owners, but to illustrate what an equalizing force the Wendigo has inadvertently played upon our land. I was well aware that the North at first was not, in the greater part, founding this conflict upon abolition. It was begun in continuance of re-establishing a nationwide union. Indeed, many of the men I encountered would just as soon be rid of the slaves as their Confederate brothers would have them forever bound to servitude. And in this let us not forget the many Southerners who had no personal vested interest in our continued oppression. To the black man, however, and to many a sympathetic white soul, that freedom from bondage was, in purest simplicity, what this war was about. In January 1863, when the Emancipation Proclamation declared the 3 million slaves within the remaining 10 Confederate states as free men, President Abraham Lincoln laid down this ethos as a war goal of the North. It was noted by many, however, that there were 5 states and various other regions, not actively in opposition to the Union, who were able to maintain their subjugation of the black man. It took nearly 3 more years for the goals of unifying the rogue states and actively outlawing slavery to run concordantly. But by that time Mr. Lincoln was no longer alive to experience the fruits of his labors. He was assassinated by those who considered his imposing of laws which made men free an act of tyranny, a word here applied to an individual bearing absolute power, but in essence outlining the nature of the way this power is used as to be cruel and oppressive. In his dying moments, the irony, I'm sure, would not be lost on Mr. Lincoln. When the war abated in 1865, I took a wife and found myself, along with many other compatriots I had made on the battlefield, oddly unsettled with the home I returned to. Leaving my newly freed mother with my sister in Aurora, I moved with my new family to Washington, D.C., and there, for a few short years, I knew peace. Once again seeking employment, first at a library, and then with the offices of a group of lawyers. Being at liberty to study hard, I did so, and when years later I first caught wind of trouble in Mississippi, I dismissed it as the inevitable pendulum swing that follows the apex of exploitation, once again burying myself in literature and historical research. That was the spring of 1872. It would be 3.5 years before the Wendigo was at my door. Throughout the months of pandemonium, while the medical and law officers tried to contain the infection, I joined and ultimately commanded a Western militia unit, remaining in the city long after it was considered a lost cause. This was finally a place I called home, and I could not let it go. It was the night of November 16th that changed everything. Patrol had lasted considerably longer as there were so few of us, and I was angling to return home. At 3 a.m. I entered the house in darkness to find ruination on the inside. Windows were shattered, furniture splintered. The run up the stairs was the heaviest I have felt my feet before or since. In the bedroom, my wife and 2 daughters were tending to my son, Frederick. In the corner was a single Wendigo, a ragged chunk of flesh still clasped between its broken teeth. The boy was lucky to have passed out. He was not awake for the worst of it. This was in the days when the infection was still believed to be something you could weather and survive. Confusion over the transmission had led some to believe themselves miraculously immune when they had simply not taken in any infected fluids. Around dawn, my child awoke again, but the only person left in the room was me. I had to look deeply into his eyes before I would accept what he had become. That was all the resolution I needed. I left our house, and along with my wife and daughters made my way east. After 2 days' travel, we stopped at Manassas, where plans were afoot to recruit a new army and take back the District of Columbia. It would be 5 long years before we marched back to the capital. But that time was the true test of my resolve, and the making of me as a man, not just in standing, but in estimation of myself. There were many disputes over what was to be done while we inhabited the city. I found myself once again through military service drafted as a protector and commanding a unit of men. It was at the Council of War on April 12, 1876, when the call went out for tactical plans to assess the area and organize recruitment. Inspired by the pioneer spirit of Lewis and Clark, I vouched that we would be best served considering the entirety as untouched wilderness, until we knew better. Small scouting parties, with larger military reinforcement if possible. We would keep our men moving rather than kicking their heels in a town awaiting battle, thus incorporating training and an active disposition into their daily routine. Many opposed, wishing instead to flee west into this unknown. I reiterated time and again that our chief weapon was knowledge, and one of our greatest enemies would be assumption. We could not expect to survive as a people in areas we had not already assessed as sustainable, since the eastern states have proven themselves to be so, and since we had already fought so hard for them for well over a century. It was a logical step taking them back over forsaking them forever. I was surprised to find I had many allies on this matter. I had not thought myself an inspiring man up until this point, merely one who can see things clearer than most. I soon found that the two were in the eyes of many, one and the same. On one morning in July of that year, I found myself in the room with U.S. Grant himself, along with his key staff. I had never so much as glimpsed him before this, so I was not without understandable anxiety. "Mr. Arlington," he said, "I am reliably informed that you have an idea for a new government division." "Sir," I replied, "in all truth I have 27 ideas." "I also hear there are elements of these that have caused some consternation," he pressed. "There are some that will no doubt be opposed, sir, and violently so," I ventured. "But power concedes nothing without demand."
"Well said."
A calm, strong voice spoke up. I looked across at the only other black face in the room. It was Frederick Douglass. The words I had spoken, I realized on the spot, were borrowed from him. Within a week I was moved into offices to commence establishing what would eventually be the National Intelligence Agency. My focus was on finding within the city the people who had the best grasp of the overall situation. I recall vividly one fellow calmly listening to me lay down my plan to open a training academy in the premises next door. He looked at me with perplexed blue eyes and stroked his mustache. "How in heaven's name did a nigger like you get such thoughts in his head?" I told him plain and simple, "Sir, I was born with the peculiar compulsion to seek out knowledge I did not yet possess. It was merely poor fortune that led to my birth in a body and place where doing so would result in my murder." That man headed west with one of the last parties before President Grant halted passage into these lands. It seemed that he would journey into the pathway of the devil he did not know, rather than follow the nigger he did. Taking much of my inspiration from Alan Pinkerton's National Detective Agency, founded some 26 years prior, I saw we required agents in the field, specialists with keen minds to gather information. However, this was a two-way street. These were not thugs sent out to spy, and if what we learned returned only to our few Washington ears, then we had already lost the war. I hit upon the word cartographer as being an evocative title for one who builds and observes, an inspiring name designed to arouse interest as opposed to aggression. As I have stated, our chief enemy is lack of knowledge among the American people. We needed to acquaint them with the facts, swiftly and with purpose, to foster forward momentum and energize a scattered population. These agents would be map makers. They would keep a journal. They would be personable, skilled negotiators, honest and understanding types. Though they had to be able to respond with deadly counterattack if necessary, they had to be more liable to win us allies than leave a trail of destruction. From this remit, the search for and the passing on of information, the National Intelligence Agency was born. Part 7. The Wider World. Additional for 1883. Prior warning. The next pages were omitted from the first edition of this handbook. It is believed by some within the RS government that they were inflammatory in tone, liable to impart fear and confusion into the hearts of the readers. I argued my case against this, citing that surviving this long will have made the American people more stern and hardy than they were being given credit for, and also instilled with a desire for clarity and truth rather than platitudes and distractions. You are not children, and we need not concern ourselves with avoiding fear. In point of fact, we must confront it, embrace it, and learn to live alongside it, if we are to get through these coming years of struggle. I was overruled, and the first printing was released without these pages. It generated such a storm of questions that would have been ably answered by what you are about to read, that I was granted a second printing. I bring this to you now in the knowledge that, like much of this book, it may not be what you wish to hear, but it is the truth nonetheless. The issue also arose as to what would occur if this book were to fall into enemy hands, specifically those of secessionists, seeking to bring down the current government and emplacing their own to serve their interests. The following warning was printed in the original handbook. Important. If you believe your life is in danger, and the information in this book will fall into the hands of any human parties in violent opposition to the reunified states of America, you must burn this book. Your standard kit contains kerosene and tinder, which can be used swiftly for this purpose. Not only has my emphatic request to have this removed finally been consented to, but I am able to reprint it here for you now and explain why I objected to its inclusion to begin with. Put simply, we cannot prevent this book from falling into hands we consider to be wrong, and there will be dissenting people who will read this no matter what measures we attempt. The reason this should not only be an occurrence allowed for, but positively encouraged, is knowledge. The dissenters believe that they are right to wish this administration overturned, because they are not yet in possession of all the facts. If they are, then they are not examining them from a broad enough scope, and setting their minds to a far enough timeline. We would rather confront them with the full truth and our plans outlined than hide and whisper in the shadows. If we hide from the few domestic enemies we have, then we also hold back from contact with the many potential allies within the American public. Clarity and truth will win us more battles than subterfuge and secrecy, especially in a war where our chief weapon is instilling in as many people as possible the knowledge required to respond accordingly. So to all who consider us enemies, please take the time to reread this text and ask yourself if this is something you would stand in the way of for the temporary illusion of personal liberties. The West. One could take a map of America, and in drawing a vertical line down the center, bisect our nation to ascertain a greater understanding of the stage of conflict that exists today. To the east, the line is drawn at Minnesota, Iowa, Missouri, Arkansas, and Louisiana. To the west lie the Dakota Territory, Nebraska, Kansas, the Indian Territory, and at the southernmost point, Texas. Everything west of this line constitutes land your government has no current plans to operate within. Due to the concentrated nature of the populations in the cities east of the line, that is where the most significant Wendigo nests lie, and that is the land we concern ourselves with. The wildlands of the West are home to the majority of remaining Indians who survived our systematic eradication. Add to this the white communities who settled before the emergence of the Wendigo and countless groups of refugees who fled the eastern states throughout the past decade, to say nothing of the countless infected who would have slipped through, given the Wendigo purchase over all the aforementioned lands and peoples. Distance, resources, and time do not allow us to send aid to the states of Oregon, Nevada, or California, the territories of Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, Idaho, and the northernmost Washington Territory. All are to be left alone. Even Texas is beyond this border, and thus beyond our reach. The sheer logistics of attempting to control the East is an almighty task requiring the cooperation I have already detailed. To factor in the West complicates matters beyond reason. However, this presents the issue of further mass exodus, emptying our lands of those suitable to serve in the military effort, leaving behind only the creatures to follow on our tails. Therefore, it was in early 1876 that President Grant initiated the Homeland Act, making passage across this pan-state line without due clearance illegal. In simplest terms, we all stay, we all fight. When victory is finally achieved as we enter the 20th century, it will be in a truly free America, and this act will be lifted. A series of checkpoints and military outposts now cover this line, keeping watchful eyes on either side. Attempting to force access will result in severe reprisal. The undisclosed dangers of a growing army of creatures to our backs, in fact, make plainer the need for unified military strength and readiness. Do not forget the West, or those who journeyed there. If we fight and live to forge our future, we will see them again.
Carmen Santos, Williamsburg, Virginia, March 29, 1882. In 1825, Samuel Finley Breese Morse was sent a letter by his father via horsebound messenger that Samuel's wife Lucretia had died a month after giving birth to their third son. Samuel raced home to New Haven, only to find that it had occurred 1 month previously, and she was already long in the ground. He had left Washington in some distress, in the middle of painting the honored French Major General Lafayette on that man's final visit to America. I can imagine the horror and frustration of being given this tragic news so late, and at such an inopportune time. Too late, in point of fact, to respond in any useful fashion. This instilled in Morse a burning desire to see our lines of communication sped up out of the dark ages of reliance upon physical travel and harnessing the wonders of the technologies emerging in our industrial age. 19 years later, in 1844, he sent the inaugural telegram from his new machine in celebration of the opening up of telegraphic communication between Washington and Baltimore. He allowed the youngest daughter of a friend, a girl named Annie Ellsworth, the opportunity to choose the first message. She selected a biblical quote. What hath God wrought? To express her astonishment at this miraculous and potentially terrifying new ability that we now had at our literal fingertips. It is not my place to assume what was going through young Annie's mind at the time, but were I there, I would assure her that if this capacity to communicate can indeed be attributed to the Almighty, then it may well be the true salvation of we, His most complex of creations. When the Wendigo hit New York City, my life was chaotically busy. So much so, in fact, that I could scarcely find the perspective I needed to react to the situation at my door. I worked at the Western Union telegraph offices in Boston, Massachusetts. We were at the time receiving an astonishing number of panicked messages from all over the country, many from around the world, being bounced from one long-distance location to the next. If the disarray in my office was anything to go by, the head offices in Manhattan would have been in constant uproar. The difficulty was with so many specialized requests, emerging news, and emergency situations to organize notification on. It was impossible to achieve everything asked of us. These were not verbose accounts, but in traditional telegram style, practical and sparing. I remember very significantly one piece of news I had to convey to the press offices. It simply said, "London on fire. Stop. Creatures in our streets. Stop. Army routed. Stop. Her Majesty fled palace. Stop. Population heading north to Scotland. Stop. Bedlam at Dover. Stop. Be advised. Europe overrun. Stop." I could not think of a more hopeless situation to have to convey. This was after months of apparent stiff upper lips over what apparently turned out to be the Wendigo threat emerging from Egypt and spreading out to Libya and the Sudan in the spring of '72. And none too subtle chidings of our military's apparent inability to contain an outbreak of rabid savages down in Mississippi. This was, I remind you, an empire. But they, along with the rest of the world, had no clue that the screaming Indian natives bearing down upon their troops in Bengal could not be threatened with guns and did not care for Britain's sovereignty. Kyushu, Japan, was struck with a wave of fleeting infected from Busan, Korea, shortly before we lost all contact with that side of the world. In St. Petersburg, Alexander Romanov II had apparently converted the Winter Palace into a fortress for all the residents of the city that could pass the mandatory health inspection. Pope Pius had declared this the end of days as Rome tore itself apart around him. And considering the biblical imagery the descriptions threw up, I cannot blame the man. As the eastern seaboard began to fall, and thousands of former New Yorkers, both in form of terrified refugees and the Wendigo at their heels, radiated out of that area, they brought with them the same chaos they were escaping. I was sitting in the eye of the information storm. Boston being a harbor city, many of the families I knew were taking boats and escaping out into the Atlantic. Ultimately, what made me leave was a single message from an unnamed telegraph operator in Brooklyn. "I can do no more good here. Stop. We'll travel until a place is found where I can stop." I hope, if only selfishly, for the sake of my dreams, that every one of these places I heard from has somehow survived this plague, that some control has been regained and governmental or military strategy has won out over the creatures, that the continents are clear of infection and sustaining vibrant human life, and simply waiting for a word from the Americas they believe to be lost. Today, I work for the NIA in the Communication Division, principally because every person they find who understands the business end of a telegraph sounder is worth their weight in gold. Or at least we would be if in 1882 that gold wasn't worth 100th its weight in strips of dried beef. I travel with a team, repairing existing lines and laying down new ones as the map is filled out, connecting town to town with thousands of miles of galvanized zinc-coated wire, the veins of civilization. When we're done, everyone will be talking. Maybe my unknown friend found his place, but I must keep traveling for the sake of what God hath wrought.
Beyond America. When considering the damage done to America by the Wendigo over the past 11 years, it is natural to question the state of the countries outside our borders. What of Europe, Africa, Asia? Here is a hard answer, but one we must accept if we are to indeed move forwards. It does not matter. Whether Europe is still affected with this blight, whether it is still overrun, whether another human being is walking the globe far from American shores, does not matter. If we are the only ones now affected, then nobody has sent us aid. If others are affected, we cannot help them. In terms purely logical and based upon reason, we must defend and clear our own house first, and regain a position of strength before tending to others. If it is a question of retreat, we have the American West to flee to, but the Wendigo will remain, and he will tread where we do, until we strike him from this earth. What of mass exodus by sea? Leave America to the creatures. Sail to other lands in the hope they are safe and welcoming. Quite apart from the statistical unlikelihood of safe shores to alight upon, this defeats the very purpose this country was founded on, that of making this land our own. It is they who shall leave. As far as communication networks, a transatlantic telegraph connection was established in July 1866, connecting Ireland to Heart's Content in East Newfoundland, Canada. However, telegraph contact with that area ceased in 1872 during the initial outbreaks, and all expeditions sent to assess the possibility of re-establishing a connection have not returned, nor have messengers sent by sea. To that end, at present, we must deduce that since many years have passed with only rumors and indirect reports from the wider world, that it is just as fraught with danger as the worst parts of America. Just as the West must be left alone, so too must the rest of the world. Fortunately, I have not yet come upon an account of expert seafaring Wendigos, so provided that there are no amassing contingents to the north, we remain free to focus on reclaiming our cities of the East. The future. In this, once again, I will not lie to the American people. The future of this nation, if it persists even 1 year beyond this point, will be hard won and dearly fought. We have lost so much already, and the flickering candle flame of hope that we will get through this dark night must be guarded and maintained. If all my intentions come to pass, and we reclaim Boston by the turn of the century, we are still looking at an uncharted West, an inhospitable jungle in the southern Americas, and a frozen tundra to our north. Combine this with a vast ocean to the east, the other side of which could hold continents filled with the twisted forms of Wendigos by the million. But ask yourself, is this really all that different from every other point in mankind's history? Was there not always some great hardship and adversity to overcome? 5 centuries ago, Europe was ravaged by the bubonic plague. 1,000 years before that, the Roman Empire faced a plague of their own. Ours is simply a plague in which the suffering and infected take on the nature of a predator. It is our duty to cleanse this land of sickness, and after that, we shall see what fortune the world shall afford us.
Commander Calvin Wilson, Washington, District of Columbia, February 19th, 1883. While surveying the land in Manitoba last spring, I grew friendly with a settlement there, located around Tawny Lake. I'd been dispatched to chart the furthest possible northern point of civilization that we could adequately maintain contact with. Needless to say, I was in no hurry to venture out into the unknown wilds and spend some time with these good people, helping them hunt, fish, and patrol the woods by day, and by listening to their stories in the warmth of their hearths by night. On my third evening, while discussing how the Wendigo outbreaks had first occurred in their region, I compared our established historical sightings ledger with their accounts, and found their first outbreaks corresponded with those down in Mississippi in 1872, almost to the same week. It would be simply impossible for a creature to make its way this far north from the plague-affected area in the southern states within this time frame. These conclusions corroborate our theories of humanity experiencing waves of infection from multiple differing global origin points. I delved further into the specifics, and though they spoke a mishmash of languages, having come from all over, I gathered that one of their number had a rather strange tale to tell. An old Inuit fellow was brought into the room and sat down in front of me. He was rather excitable, and though infuriatingly for my purposes mute, he was able to convey a substantial amount of information to his two granddaughters, Kanik and Puluktuk, who in turn had their dialect translated by a French chap named Renard, with a passing grasp of the Queen's English. This is what I learned. The Inuit, whose name was Tukuyumavunga, though to my relief I was permitted to call him Tuku, had been fishing in Tehek Lake in Nunavut, far north from Manitoba, across many stretches of icy wilderness. Something had caught his eye, hanging in the air above the water. The way he described it, one could ascribe some trick of the light. He took my handkerchief from me, folded it diagonally several times over, and then held it up before my eyes, taut between gripping forefingers and thumbs to resemble some kind of aperture. Though this may be some mistranslation, he said it was a fold in the air, some 7 feet from pinnacle to base, and composed of the wind. Apparently this phenomenon had caused quite a stir when he reported it back to his village, and several men in boats had come out to take a look, though nobody ventured to touch it while he was present. Some days after that, several members of his village had gone missing, reappearing some time later in a fearful, delirious state that Tuku was now familiar with as the first stages of man's metamorphosis into the Wendigo. It was Tuku's suspicion that one or two of them had braved contact with the Wind Door, the other side of which, Tuku now believed, was home only to ghosts. I asked him to take me to this place, but learned from the others assembled that a massive outbreak occurred there soon after this initial contamination. Nobody would go near Nunavut, and they strongly advised me to stay away myself. It is my contention that this aperture Tuku spoke of is absolutely the source of the Wendigo plague. I do not believe in ghosts, but I know that if he spoke the truth, then man should not have come into contact with whatever is on the other side of this veil. I also believe that if we dig deep enough into the survivors of the Mississippi outbreaks, we will find someone with a corroborating story of a similar fold in the air. If this is indeed a worldwide occurrence, then there will be more still, though I'll warrant not many would be required to cause this level of social breakdown in an unprepared civilization. Tomorrow I return north, with a small group of worthy, intelligent field agents. Having imparted this key information to Director Arlington, which I believe deserves inclusion in a second printing of the Cartographer's Handbook, so that we may draw out further clues to this new development.
Of letters and stories and poems and tomes for you, parables rich with the riddles you'd wrestle with if you'd read them through. But light leaks through these lines, and fiction my pen will not obey, my characters don't stay. An avalanche rolled across the one road between us and town. So we stayed and we played with the bones, and we watched the sad solstice sun go down. Stuck in the silence of acres of snow, tempting the tokens you took. And you want to get back to your drinks with the boys, and I want to keep writing my book, 'cause I'm where he said, she said no, and she said he shouldn't go. I know what they'll decide, I'll steer their words aright. But if your wheels get too even, if you drive like you're drunk, you can blame it on the ruts in the road. And if the big bad guys tail you, if the little ones honk, then just lean into your staggering load. It's a perilous road, a perilous road, a perilous road. It's a perilous road, a perilous road, a perilous road. I want one more chance, an allowance advance. I want absolution too. So they'll stay and they'll weigh all the good times and bad, and they'll talk the matter through. I'll make them both make nice. I'll clear the mud and ice. I'll send them home tonight, and she'll sit down and write, displacing her curses on second, third persons. She'll fill 3 pages of mine. We'll write about writers who can't seem to write the reveals outside the lines. Stuck in the silence of acres of snow, struggling to structure the book. And they say that by now the way out may be cleared, and I don't think I like your look. And we'll bury bones beneath a list of make-believe. But my pen will not obey, my characters don't stay. But if your wheels get too even, if you drive like you're drunk, you can blame it on the ruts in the road. And if the big bad guys tail you, if the little ones honk, then just lean into your worrisome load. And if you're rolling too fast, if your exit's just past, you can blame it on the ruts in the road. And if you're running too hard for the lamp oil you brought, then just lean into your punishing load. It's a perilous road, a perilous road. But if your wheels get too even, if you drive like you're drunk, you can blame it on the ruts in the road. And if the big bad guys tail you, if the little ones honk, then just lean into your punishing load. And if changes come slow, love the farther you go, blame it on the ruts in the road. And if your story don't follow that old plot you borrowed, then lean into your staggering load. It's a perilous road, a perilous road, a perilous road. It's a perilous road, a perilous road, a perilous